It was a cold and cloudy morning in Chicago. The streets were wet from last night's rain, and the city moved fast like always, cars honking, people rushing to work, and no one noticing the man sitting quietly on a bench near the bus station. His name was James Turner. He was in his 60s, with gray hair, a tired face, and eyes that had seen more pain than most people could imagine. He wore a dirty old army jacket and boots that had holes in them. His hands were rough and cold, and he held a small cloth bag in his lap. He didn't beg for money. He didn't speak to anyone. He just sat there, still as a statue, lost in thought. People walked past him like he didn't exist. A few gave him strange looks. Some pulled their children a little closer as they passed by. In a city full of people, James Turner was completely invisible. But that morning, things would change. A security guard working nearby noticed James sitting too long near the private bus parking area. The guard thought he looked suspicious. Maybe he was just another homeless man looking for shelter, or maybe he was dangerous. At least that's what the guard told himself. So he called the police. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived. 2 officers stepped out. They didn't yell or push James. They just walked up to him and asked him to move. James didn't argue. He looked up slowly, his eyes calm but tired, and said, "I'm just resting. I didn't mean any harm." One of the officers told him he was trespassing. James nodded like he expected it. He didn't shout or get angry. He simply stood up, picked up his small bag, and said, "All right." But when they asked him for ID, James had none. He didn't even have a wallet. "What's your full name?" one officer asked. "James H. Turner," he replied. They ran his name through the system, but nothing came up. No recent address, no social security record, nothing current. It was as if he had disappeared from the world. The officers decided to take him in for trespassing, just to figure out who he was. They didn't see a war veteran. They didn't know his story. To them, he was just another homeless man with no identity, another file to complete. Inside the police car, James sat silently. He looked out the window as the city moved by. The buildings, the lights, the people. It all felt distant to him. He had once been a part of this world. He had once worn a uniform, marched with pride, carried wounded soldiers out of enemy fire. But now, all he had left was an old medal in his bag, and the memories that haunted his sleep. At the police station, they booked him. Fingerprints, mugshot, paperwork. One officer asked, "Any next of kin?" James shook his head. No family, no friends, no one to call. They placed him in a holding cell. It was cold and smelled of old cement. James sat in the corner, hugging his knees, thinking about nothing and everything all at once. The truth was, James had once been a hero. He had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He had led missions, saved lives, and earned medals. But after the war, life changed. His mind wasn't the same. He started having nightmares, couldn't sleep, couldn't think clearly. He had trouble finding work. The VA hospital was always crowded, and the system was confusing. Little by little, he slipped through the cracks. First, he lost his job, then his apartment, then his phone. Eventually, even his dignity felt like it had vanished. He never wanted to become homeless. No one does. But the world is harsh, and for someone like James, quiet, suffering, and forgotten, it was even harder. He learned how to survive on the streets. He found places to hide during the winter, learned which soup kitchens gave warm meals, and always kept his small bag close. Inside it was his Silver Star medal, a few photos of his fellow soldiers, and a dog tag he never wore anymore. That night in the cell, James didn't sleep. He sat quietly, remembering his unit, the noise of helicopters, the smell of sand and blood, and the sound of distant explosions. He remembered carrying a wounded soldier across open ground while bullets flew past him. He remembered holding his friend as he died. And he remembered returning home, hoping for peace, but finding only loneliness. The next morning, a public defender came to see him. Her name was Maria Delgado. She was in her 30s, smart, kind, and overworked like most public defenders. When she saw James, she greeted him politely and sat across from him at the small metal table. "Mr. Turner," she said gently, "I've been assigned to represent you for your trespassing charge. I'd like to ask you a few questions." James nodded. Maria noticed his calm posture, his polite tone, and the way he looked at her with steady eyes. Something about him didn't feel like the others she'd represented. She asked where he had been living. "Mostly outside," James replied. "Sometimes shelters, but not always." "Do you have any ID?" "No." "Do you have any health conditions?" James paused. "I served in the military, got hurt. I don't sleep well." Maria made notes. She asked if he had ever received mental health treatment. "A long time ago," he said. "But it didn't help much." As she packed her notes, she noticed something. A small cloth bag poked out of his pocket. When James saw her glance at it, he pulled it out and opened it slightly. He showed her a medal, shiny, old, and worn from being handled too much. Maria gasped softly. "Is that a silver star?" James nodded. "You're a decorated veteran." "I used to be," he said quietly. Maria froze for a moment. She looked at him differently now. She realized this wasn't just another homeless man. This was someone who had served the country with honor, someone who had risked his life many times. And now, he was facing a trial for simply sitting too long in a place no one wanted him. She told him she would do everything she could to help. James nodded again, but he didn't look hopeful. People had said that before. People had promised to help, to call back, to look into his case. No one ever did. But Maria was different. She left the jail with a strange feeling in her heart. Something about James Turner stirred her. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Why was his name not showing up in the records? How did a man like that become invisible? She knew she had to dig deeper. Meanwhile, James sat alone again. Another night in the cell. Another night remembering war, pain, and silence. But for the first time in many years, someone had looked him in the eye with respect. Someone had seen the human beneath the dirt, beneath the silence, beneath the broken shell. And though James didn't know it yet, this arrest, this simple moment of being noticed, would change everything. Because someone had finally asked the right question. Someone had finally cared. And the world that had turned its back on him for years was about to remember who James H. Turner really was. And it all began with that cold morning on a bus bench, where no one thought a hero could be sitting, wrapped, in silence and sorrow, waiting for the world to see him again. Maria Delgado sat at her desk late that night, long after most of her co-workers had left the office. Papers were stacked high around her coffee had gone cold, and her eyes were tired. But something inside her wouldn't let her rest. It was James Turner. His quiet voice, his calm manner, and most of all, that medal he had pulled out from his bag. A silver star. That was no small thing. That medal was given only to soldiers who had shown extreme bravery in combat. It wasn't something just anyone received. And yet James Turner had shown it so quietly, like it didn't matter anymore. Like his past had been buried beneath years of pain. Maria kept thinking about the way he spoke, the way he looked into her eyes without fear, and how his name didn't show up in any recent system records. She had seen a lot of homeless clients in her time, people lost in addiction, people who had simply been forgotten. But James was different. There was a weight in his silence, like he had carried something heavy for a long time. She felt something was missing, something big. She had to know who he really was. She opened her laptop and began to search. She typed his name, James H. Turner, into every database she could access. At first nothing came up. No driver's license, no recent mailing address, no bank account, no voter registration. It was like he didn't exist. But Maria wasn't the kind of person who gave up easily. After several hours of digging, she found an old military personnel list from 2004. It was a file she had access to from a veteran support program she once volunteered with. There it was. Staff Sergeant James Henry Turner, U.S. Army, served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Her heart skipped a beat. She clicked on the record and began to read. The file was filled with military codes and language she didn't fully understand, but some things were very clear. James had served 3 tours overseas. He had led a squad during a mission in Kandahar, where an enemy ambush had left several U.S. soldiers wounded and trapped. Despite being injured himself, James had gone back into enemy fire to rescue them. He pulled one man out from a burning vehicle and carried him to safety. He had been shot during that mission, but still managed to return fire and protect his unit. For his actions, he was awarded the Silver Star. Maria leaned back in her chair, stunned. This wasn't just a veteran, this was a war hero. But that raised even more questions. How did a man like that end up homeless? Why wasn't he receiving help from the Veterans Affairs Department? How did he fall off the radar so completely? She kept reading. After James returned home from his final tour, he was discharged with honors. But in the years after that, the trail went cold. No more updates, no job history, no medical follow-ups. She saw a note. VA contact attempted. No response. Case closed. Just like that. His file had been closed, forgotten, filed away. Like a dusty old folder no one cared about anymore. Maria felt anger rise in her chest. This man had risked his life for his country, and now he was sitting in a jail cell over something as small as trespassing. It felt unfair. No, it felt wrong. She grabbed her phone and called one of her old contacts at the VA hospital. "I need information about a veteran," she said. "James H. Turner. He received a Silver Star. He's homeless now and in trouble." The woman on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then she replied, "That name, it sounds familiar. Give me a moment." After a few minutes, the woman came back. "We had a file on him years ago. He came in once or twice for PTSD treatment, but he stopped showing up. We sent letters, but none came back. Eventually, we assumed he had moved or passed away. We closed the case. He didn't die," Maria said. "He just disappeared, and no one tried hard enough to find him." The woman sighed. "Sadly, it happens more than you think." Maria thanked her and hung up. She sat there, staring at the screen. Her heart felt heavy. The system had failed James Turner. The country he fought for had left him behind. But Maria wasn't going to let that be the end of his story. The next day, she returned to the jail to speak to him again. James was brought into the small visiting room. He looked the same, quiet, still, and calm. Maria smiled at him. "I did some research," she said. "I know who you are now." James tilted his head slightly. "Who am I then?" "Your staff sergeant." "James Henry Turner," she said softly. "Silver Star recipient. War hero." James looked down. He didn't say anything. "You saved lives," Maria continued. "You were injured, but you kept going. You were brave." James looked up at her, his eyes full of pain. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Doesn't mean anything now." "It does," Maria said firmly. "You're not just some homeless man who wandered too close to a bus station. You deserve better." James shook his head slowly. "People always say that, but nothing changes." "I want to help you," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, like he was trying to decide if he could trust her. Then he nodded once. "Okay." Maria left that day feeling determined. She wasn't just going to defend him in court. She was going to make sure people remembered who he was. She made calls to veteran organizations, support groups, even the local news. She wanted his story known, not because he needed pity, but because people needed to understand what happened when heroes were forgotten. She printed out documents, prepared a file, and submitted it to the court. She added a formal request to have James's case moved to a veterans treatment program instead of regular trial. She attached his military records, medical history, and a letter she had written herself about who he was and what he had done. The court date was set. Maria prepared for it like it was the most important case of her life. Meanwhile, back in the jail, James began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Just a small bit. Like a light flickering in a very dark room. Every day still felt long, every night was still cold, but now there was a lawyer who saw him, someone who didn't treat him like a lost cause. One night he opened his bag and pulled out the medal again. He stared at it for a long time. His fingers ran over the edges of the silver star. It had once meant everything to him. Now it felt like a ghost from a different life. But for the first time in years, he let himself remember. Not just the pain and blood, but the pride too, the sense of purpose. He thought about the soldiers he had fought beside. Some had died, some had survived. All of them had called him Sarge. They had trusted him, followed him into battle. He had been someone back then. Maybe, just maybe, he could be someone again. As the court date came closer, Maria kept working. She even managed to contact one of James's old squad members through a veterans forum. The man's name was Alan Brooks, and when he heard about James, he nearly broke down on the phone. "James saved my life," Alan said. "We all thought he was dead. We tried to find him after the war, but no one could. We gave up." "Well," Maria said, "he's alive, and he needs help." Alan promised to come to court if he could. He wanted to stand by his sergeant again. The day before the hearing, Maria visited James once more. "Tomorrow is your day," she told him. "Whatever happens, I want you to know. I'm proud to stand beside you." James smiled faintly. "You remind me of someone," he said. "Who?" "My daughter," he whispered. "She used to believe in me too." Maria's heart ached. "Maybe she still does." James didn't reply, but he held the medal a little tighter that night. The next morning the court would see James Turner, not as a criminal, not as a homeless man, but as the man he truly was. A man who had once been a hero, and who still carried that courage quietly inside him, even when the world forgot his name. But that was about to change. The courtroom was quiet that morning. It wasn't like the big courts people saw in movies. It was small, simple, with a few wooden benches and a judge's desk at the front. But something about that day felt different. People who usually didn't care about such hearings were sitting in the back rows, waiting. There were other cases scheduled, but everyone was there for one person: James H. Turner. Maria Delgado walked into the courtroom early, carrying a folder full of papers. Her face looked calm, but her heart was beating fast. She had done everything she could to prepare. She had printed James's military records, added newspaper clips from years ago when his name was mentioned in a story about a brave rescue in Afghanistan, and even included letters from people who knew him long ago. She had written a statement from her heart, a message about what kind of man James really was. James entered the courtroom next. 2 guards walked beside him, but they didn't hold him like a dangerous person. James wore a clean shirt Maria had brought him and some donated clothes. His boots were still old, but they were polished. He held his small cloth bag close to his chest. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room slowly. He didn't recognize anyone, yet. Then, from the back, "Row?" A man stood up. He was tall, had gray hair, and wore a dark blue jacket with an army logo on it. His name was Alan Brooks, the soldier James had saved many years ago. When James saw him, he paused. His eyes widened a little, and his mouth opened just slightly, in surprise. Alan nodded once. James nodded back. For the first time in a long while, James didn't feel alone. The judge entered the courtroom. Everyone stood up. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a calm voice. She had heard many cases in her life, but she had read the file Maria had submitted, and she already knew this was not an ordinary case. Case number 7392, The People versus James H. Turner, the clerk called. Maria stood. Maria Delgado, defense attorney for Mr. Turner, Your Honor. The prosecutor, a young man who seemed unsure about the case, simply said, "Prosecution is present, Your Honor." James stood up too, silent and calm. The judge looked down at her papers, then at James. "Mr. Turner, you've been charged with trespassing on private property. However, there are additional documents submitted regarding your service and personal history. I would like to hear from your attorney first." Maria stepped forward. Her voice was clear and steady. "Your Honor, James H. Turner is not just a man who wandered into a bus station. He is a decorated war hero. He served 3 tours in the U.S. Army, saved the lives of several soldiers, and received the Silver Star for bravery. After returning from war, he suffered from PTSD and other medical conditions. He was lost in the system, without proper help. The world forgot him. But I am asking this court not to forget." She paused and opened the folder. "I have his military records, medical notes, and a signed letter from one of the men he saved. That man is sitting right here in this courtroom." The judge raised her eyebrows and looked at Alan. "Would he like to speak?" she asked. Maria nodded, and Alan stood up. He walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. Everyone watched him, in silence. "Your Honor," Alan said, his voice deep and strong, "I served with Staff Sergeant James Turner in Afghanistan. I was there the day he saved my life. I was trapped in a burning vehicle, and everyone else thought I was dead. James didn't. He ran back under enemy fire, pulled me out, and carried me to safety even though he was already bleeding from his leg. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him." Alan's voice cracked a little, but he kept going. "We came back from war and went our separate ways. I tried to find him, but I couldn't. I thought maybe he didn't make it. But now, I see he did make it, and the country let him down. I just want this court to see what kind of man he really is." The courtroom was silent. You could feel the emotion in the air. The judge nodded slowly and thanked Alan. Then she looked at the prosecutor. "Do you have anything to add?" The young prosecutor stood and said, "Your Honor, I have reviewed the defense's documents. We do not wish to continue with the trespassing charge. We believe Mr. Turner qualifies for a veteran diversion program, and we support the defense's request." The judge nodded again. "Mr. Turner," she said, "you've had a difficult life since returning from war. You've been forgotten by systems that should have helped you. But I see you now, and I'm deeply sorry for what you've been through. I am dismissing the charges against you. You will be referred to a veteran support program to help you recover, and we will make sure you are not alone in this journey." The courtroom was quiet for a moment, and then something unexpected happened. The judge stood, and slowly, one by one, so did everyone else. Lawyers, officers, clerks, and strangers, people who didn't even know James, stood up. Even the prosecutor, who had barely said a word, stood. It wasn't planned. It wasn't told. But they all stood, in silence, with respect. James didn't know what to do. He looked around, confused. Then Maria whispered, "They're standing for you, James, because of who you are." James slowly stood straighter. He looked across the room, his eyes filling with tears, not because he was sad, but because for the first time in years, he was seen. Not as a homeless man, not as a criminal, but as a man who had given everything and asked for nothing. The judge smiled gently. "You may step down, Mr. Turner." As James turned to leave, Alan stepped beside him. He reached out his hand. James hesitated, then took it. The two men walked out of the courtroom together. Outside the courthouse, news reporters waited. Somehow, word had gotten out. People wanted to know the story of the veteran who had once been forgotten but was now remembered. Maria shielded James from the cameras, but one reporter called out, "Mr. Turner, do you have anything to say?" James paused. Then he turned slightly and said softly, "Don't forget the others." That was all, but it meant everything. Later that day, Maria helped James check into a special veteran housing center. He was given a warm bed, clean clothes, and a medical appointment for the next day. For the first time in years, James didn't have to sleep with one eye open. He didn't have to keep his cloth bag clutched to his chest. He was safe. That night, as he lay in bed, James reached into his bag and pulled out the medal. He placed it on the small table beside him and stared at it. It still felt heavy, but now in a different way. Not just with memories, but with meaning. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was proof that he mattered. Maria visited him often. She made sure he had everything he needed. And Alan? He came back the next weekend, and the weekend after that. They started talking more. About old times, about war, about healing. James didn't become famous. He didn't want to. But his story spread across the country. It was shared in newspapers, on TV, and on the internet. People who had forgotten about homeless veterans were reminded. People started asking questions. Donations poured into veteran shelters. And across America, people began to notice the invisible ones again. But for James, the biggest change wasn't outside. It was inside. He was no longer invisible. He was James H. Turner, soldier, brother, hero, human. James Turner woke up early, even before the sun came out. For years, his mornings had started on hard benches, under bridges, or in cold alleys. But now, he was waking up in a clean bed, in a warm room at the Veteran Housing Center. It still felt strange to him. Soft sheets, running water, hot meals. These were all things he had gone without for so long. Every time he opened his eyes, he had to remind himself that it was real. He wasn't dreaming. He wasn't back in war or on the street. He was safe. He got up slowly, still used to checking his surroundings out of habit. He touched the small, wooden table beside the bed. His Silver Star medal was still there. He looked at it for a moment, like he did every morning now, just to feel grounded. That medal had been the only thing he kept all those years. Now it had its own place again. He went to the kitchen where other veterans were already having breakfast. Some greeted him with a nod, others with a quiet, "Morning, Sarge," after hearing his story. It made him feel seen, like he was part of something again. Later that day, Maria Delgado came by. She had become more than just his lawyer. She was now a friend. She checked in on him often, helped him with paperwork, and made sure he was keeping up with his appointments. "Big day today," Maria said, sitting with him in the courtyard. "Your first group therapy session. You okay with that?" James nodded slowly. "Don't know if I'll talk, but I'll listen." "That's good enough," she smiled. One step at a time. At first, the idea of therapy had made James nervous. Talking about his past was not something he wanted to do. For years, he had kept everything locked inside. Every painful memory, every moment of fear, every face he'd seen in battle. But Maria had gently explained that healing meant facing those memories, not hiding from them. He walked into the therapy room that afternoon. There were about 8 other veterans in a circle. Some were younger, some older. Each of them carried their own invisible wounds. The counselor, a man named Paul, who was also a former Marine, welcomed everyone warmly. "This is a safe space," Paul said. "Whatever is said here stays here. We talk, we listen, we heal together." James stayed quiet at first, just like he had planned. Others spoke about sleepless nights, about losing friends in battle, about feeling angry all the time or feeling nothing at all. And James listened. He didn't move much, but every word hit deep. One man talked about hearing fireworks and thinking it was gunfire. Another said he couldn't walk into crowded places anymore. James understood all of it. It was like they were reading pieces of his own story out loud. Then someone asked him directly, "What about you, Sarge? What's your story?" James paused. The room got quiet. "I was in Kandahar," he said slowly. "My team got hit in an ambush. I went back for one of my guys. We both made it out, but I never came back the same." No one judged him. No one interrupted. They just listened. James continued, "When I got home, I tried to act normal. Got a job. Lived in a small apartment. But the noise in my head, it never stopped. I started sleeping in my car. Then the car was gone. After that, just the streets. There was a long silence. Then one of the other vets said, "Glad you're here now." And for the first time, James felt a little lighter. After the session, Paul told James, "You don't have to say a lot. Just showing up means you're fighting again." James nodded. He had fought many battles before, but this one, fighting, to heal, was the hardest. Over the next few weeks, James started building a routine. He went to therapy twice a week. He met with a job counselor who helped him plan for work. He saw a doctor who treated his knee injury and helped him with his PTSD. And through all of it, Maria kept checking in. Sometimes just to chat. Sometimes with a new form to fill. She even brought him books when she learned he liked to read. One afternoon, Alan Brooks visited again. The two men sat outside under a tree, drinking coffee and talking about old times. "You remember Jenkins?" Alan's asked. "The kid with freckles?" James said. "Yeah. He's a firefighter now, married, 2 kids." James smiled. It felt good to know his men had made it. They had lived. Alan reached into his jacket and handed James a photo. It was their old squad, standing together in full gear, dusty and tired, but smiling. "I had this printed for you," Alan said. "Thought you might want to remember the good times." James took the photo with care. He stared at it for a long time. His hands shook a little, but he didn't let go. Later that evening, James sat alone in his room. He placed the photo next to the silver star on the table. 2 pieces of his past, finally together in peace. Weeks turned into months. James applied for a veteran's pension and was approved. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to live on. He didn't have to worry about finding his next meal anymore. He even started helping out around the center, fixing broken furniture, organizing books, walking with other vets who didn't want to go to therapy alone. He still had nightmares sometimes. He still woke up sweating, hearing echoes from the battlefield. But he wasn't alone anymore. That made all the difference. One day the center hosted a community event. People from the city were invited to learn more about the struggles of homeless veterans. There were speeches, music, food, and booths where volunteers could sign up to help. Maria asked James if he wanted to speak. "Me?" he said, surprised. "Yes, you," she smiled. "Tell your story. People need to hear it." James hesitated, but then he nodded. When he stepped up to the small stage, people clapped politely. They didn't know him. Not yet. He cleared his throat and began. "I'm James H. Turner. I served in the Army for 13 years. I fought in wars most people try to forget. I came home and got lost in the system, in my own head, in the streets. For a long time I thought I didn't matter anymore. I carried a medal in my pocket while sleeping on sidewalks." He paused, then looked out at the crowd. "But I was wrong. People do care. Some just need to be reminded. I got a second chance. Not because I asked for help, but because someone saw me when I couldn't see myself. That someone was Maria Delgado. She didn't give up, and now I won't give up either. Not on myself, not on others like me." The crowd stood and clapped. Some wiped their eyes. After the event, a young boy walked up to James with his father. "Sir," the boy said, holding out a small flag, "thank you for your service." James took the flag gently and smiled. "Thank you, son." That night James sat in his room again, looking at the photo and the medal. But now there was something new on the table. A small folded paper flag from a child. That flag meant the world to him. He had been to war. He had been homeless. He had stood in front of a judge as a criminal. But now he was something else. He was healing. He was giving back. He was beginning again, and for the first time in years, James didn't feel broken. He felt whole. Months passed since James Turner's court day. The world outside kept moving fast, but for James, life was slowly changing in ways he never imagined. Each morning he woke up with a quiet hope. The cold, lonely nights on the streets were memories, but sometimes they felt close, like shadows that could return any time. He knew his journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. One bright morning, Maria knocked on his door with a big smile. "James, I have some news for you," she said, holding a thick envelope. James sat on the edge of his bed, curious but cautious. "What is it?" Maria handed him the envelope. "It's from a Veterans Foundation. They want to help you get a small apartment, a real home." James blinked, stunned. "A home? Me?" "Yes. You've done your part. You fought for this country. Now it's time for this country to fight for you." That afternoon, James went to meet the Foundation's team. They were kind people who wanted to help veterans rebuild their lives. They talked about a place with a roof, a kitchen, and a bed that belonged only to him. It sounded almost too good to be true. "Are you sure this is for me?" James asked. One woman smiled gently. "You deserve it, James. Everyone deserves a safe place to live." A few weeks later, James moved into a small but cozy apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. There was a living room with a worn-out couch, a tiny kitchen with an old stove, and a bedroom with soft sheets. For the first time in a long time, James felt a calm he didn't know he could have. The apartment walls were mostly empty, but James began to fill them slowly. He hung the squad photo Alan had given him on one wall. The Silver Star Medal was displayed proudly on a small shelf. He even put up a calendar where he marked the days he had therapy or appointments. Each mark was a victory. Life wasn't perfect. Some days James felt lonely. Sometimes the memories of war and the streets came back like storms inside his mind. But now he had tools to fight those storms. He talked to his counselor regularly, met with other veterans, and found peace in small things: a warm meal, a quiet morning, a friendly smile. One day, Alan came to visit. "Ready for that fishing trip I promised?" he asked with a grin. James laughed. "I don't know if I remember how." "It's like riding a bike, Sarge," Alan said. "You just never forget." They spent the weekend by a lake, sitting quietly, fishing rods in hand. No need for many words. The water was calm, the sun was warm, and for a little while, James felt free. Back in the city, James got involved with a veterans group that helped others like him, men and women who had lost their way after serving. He started volunteering, helping others find the resources he had found. He listened to their stories and shared his own, always careful to remind them that healing was possible. James also started attending community events, telling his story wherever people would listen. He spoke at schools, churches, and public gatherings. His message was simple: no one who serves should ever be forgotten, no matter what struggles they face later. Sometimes reporters called him, asking about his journey from homelessness to hope. At first James was shy, but then he realized that by sharing, he was shining a light on the hidden lives of so many veterans. He wasn't just telling his story, he was telling theirs too. One cold winter evening, James received a letter in the mail. It was from a young soldier who had just returned from deployment and was struggling. The letter said, "Your story gave me hope. Thank you for showing me it's okay to ask for help." James held the letter close. It was proof that his pain had meaning, that his life, after all the darkness, was now helping others find light over time. James reconnected with family members he hadn't seen in years. They were surprised to find him changed, stronger, and open. Old wounds began to heal. His relationship with Maria grew deeper too. They celebrated small victories together, getting his benefits sorted, attending medical appointments, or simply sharing a meal. Maria wasn't just his lawyer or friend, she became family. One spring afternoon, James was invited to a ceremony honoring veterans in the city. The hall was filled with people clapping and cheering. When James's name was called, the crowd stood again. Just like the day in the courtroom, James walked to the stage, holding his silver star. He looked at the faces before him, veterans, families, community members, and strangers who cared. He spoke clearly. "I was once lost, forgotten by the very country I fought for. But today, I stand here because of kindness, support, and hope. To anyone out there struggling, don't give up. Help is out there. You are not alone." Tears filled many eyes, including James's own. But these were tears of strength, not sorrow. After the ceremony, children gathered around him. They wanted to hear stories about bravery, about the army, and about the medals. James told them tales of courage, but also about the importance of kindness and helping others. One little girl handed him a drawing she made, a soldier standing tall, surrounded by hearts. James smiled. "Thank you," he said softly. "This means the world." Years later, James would look back on that time as the turning point. From a homeless veteran on trial to a man who found a home, purpose, and family. It was never easy, but every step mattered. James knew many veterans were still struggling, that the system still had holes that needed fixing. So he kept speaking, helping, and fighting. Not with weapons, but with words, actions, and heart. His story was not just about him. It was about every soldier who gave their all and deserved to be seen, helped, and honored. And in the end, James Turner was more than just a veteran. He was a symbol of hope, healing, and the power of never giving up.